Hey, welcome. Thanks for coming along again to another wee chat. This time we're going to chat about mash bills, different grains that we use, different ways of processing them, and kind of different flavours that we get out of those mash bills. So it's interesting that we've got a Scots distiller and Irish distiller here. Might tell us about the different mash bills you're using and how you process them. Scott?
Okay, well I'll start off. So first and foremost, we don't have a mash tun. We've got a mash filter. So by having a mash filter, we can then process different grains. By having a mash filter, I'm not requiring the husk of the grain to act as a filter media. I've got a physical filter press for that. And as such, I don't have a roller mill, I use a hammer mill. So that enables me to process harder grains as well. What we also have is we then have normal stills, but I also have a Loman still, the Loman still being a pot still with plates on the neck. So with that combination, it enables us to look at different flavour combinations. So for us, the grain that we've done a lot of work on has been rye. Historically, rye's got a high level of beta-glucans in it. So for a normal distillery running that, I'll probably find that it holds the water a lot. It means there's no drain off because the beta-glucans are binding it all in. It's what gives bread its strength. By having a mash conversion vessel, we can mashing at a lower temperature and slowly cycle up to ultimately a higher temperature to get the salification of the starch. By going at a lower temperature, we can get the beta-glucanase, which is already part of the grain itself, to convert all those beta-glucans. And during the processing of that, the wort is the same, it looks the same clarity. What that tastes like in the new make spirit is a wonderful spiciness that you get in the nose, and that's what rye whiskey, when you hear about American rye, which is where the grain is predominantly more used, it's a very, very spicy. In America, they tend to do it as a column still rather than a pot still as well. So the pot still for us gives it a lovely balanced flavour. So we've done, as I said, we've done rye, we've also done it with oats, and we've also done it with wheat. The oats is when there's a lot more husk than the normal grain. That gave us a little bit of processing problems regarding the density of it, but we managed to overcome that with changing the parameters. And using the same sort of mash bill as the rye, but changing the rye to oats, the final distillate is a lovely, it's like porridge oats on the nose, and then on the taste it's a lovely creaminess. And we hear about a lot of brewers using the oats because it gives a lovely balanced creaminess to the final beer. So we were just trying to see if we could get that same creaminess in the final distillate. And then by doing it with wheat's been historically used in continuous distillation grain whisky. So again, we took the wheat we used, decided to go for malted wheat, just because we'd done malted rye and malted oats. So we wanted to have a common theme for that and really just understanding what the flavour profile was like. Again, using the Loman still, and the flavour profile was a lot more complex than what we got with the rye and what we got with the oats. Now the difficult part is then how can we showcase that liquid during the maturation, which is what we're looking at. But the equipment that we have and where the mash conversion vessel was key for the operation, especially of the rye. Without that, I think it would be really, really difficult to process.
Thanks, Scott. And that's similar equipment that you use?
Similar to a degree. Now, where Scott would have used, am I correct in saying, like up to about 100% of rye or oats, we tend to use mixed mash bills, so ratios of different grains. So we don't have a mash filter press, so I wouldn't use it, but and that's most relevant for things like rye. But our ratios of rye wouldn't generally go higher than 30%. So when you factor that in with a mash bill, that the rest of the mash would be made up of malted and unmalted barley, you tend to get your filter bed. There are some challenges, but you tend to get a filter bed acting that way. It would be nice to have a mash filter, of course, and to be able to push beyond that. But no, we tend to have a mixed mash bill. So the processing issues are the same in that sense, but we kind of avoid the filtering issues by not going too high and instead mixing the grains. So where, like you mentioned, rye has no husk, but then oats has a little bit too much between the two. Then they create a kind of a balance within that. And then same thing, we do have, and it is an essential part, more essential than the mash filter press in my, if keeping the correct ratios. It's that ability to go through the different temperature ranges. If you didn't do that, then realistically you're just putting stuff in there for the sake of it. You're adding issues to yourself without getting the benefits. If you're not breaking down this extra extractable material, then there's no point really putting it in there. So the mash filter press, it would be a common theme if you want to process these grains, to just have those different temperature ranges. And then because of the fact that we use different ratios of different grains or mixed recipes, it's not as clear cut, obviously, of specific flavour profiles. And myself and Fionnán have worked on a project where we try to explore and control variables and see what flavour profiles are created from certain mash bills. And when exploring this, I suppose we both admitted to this after, we were probably too focused in on certain elements. So when we added oats, we were really focused on, what will oats do? But the way that oats or any of the other grains reacted and the flavours they created was very much in reaction to the other components. We tried to make a traditional pot still style by keeping no less than 30% malted barley, no less than 30% unmalted barley, and then no more than 30% of these other oats, wheat and rye in whatever combinations. And I suppose one of the simplest ways is the ratio of the malt to unmalted barley. If when we went high in unmalted barley tends to bring in a kind of a gingery, spry liveliness and a bit more viscosity and I suppose a depth to be able to carry flavour profile. So when you bring in something like oats, we found a lot of sweetness with the oats as well, with the creaminess you spoke of. But the way that sweetness manifested itself when you went high in malted barley, it amplified more like natural jam, plum, fruit sweetness that came through. Sorbet type, like rounded, like naturally occurring sweetness you bite into a fruit, a fleshy fruit, that type of thing. When you went high in the unmalted barley, you got far more of an artificial type sweetness that would occur in icing sugar or a zingy kind of candy bars that you really probably shouldn't be eating as a child, but you're attracted to. They're those type of
wedding cake,
those kind of flavour profiles. And then again, to take that a step further, wheat was one that surprised us, and I probably had least expectations entering into working with wheat, as far as I just thought it might be just a bit of a filler and it wouldn't have, but it was probably the one that was most complex in its contribution. And to finally to come back to rye. Rye was one that has historically been used in smaller proportions more commonly than others, and we found, I suppose there was a curiosity as to why would they put in 1 or 2% of the mash bill being rye, what's the point? But more so than any of the other grains, it was the one that started to be noticeable at its lowest ratios. It brought in that clove and that spice, a little bit of licorice, and it was unmistakably there. You could notice it in 1 or 2% of like an exact same recipe with 1 or 2% rye and without. And so when we were exploring it further, and we thought, well, if it's like this at 1%, what is it going to be like when we go to 10, 20, 30%? We found, unlike the others, it wasn't quite as linear. It had its influence. So it was you were nearly losing out on the added little bit of complexity of if like you said, working within the ratio of no more than 30% of these adjuncts. If you went to 30% on the rye, you were taking away space from oats or wheat being part of it, and it was that diminishing return where you didn't get an amplification of these flavour characteristics. So it's like to put it too crude, like a pepper shaker. It adds in that little bit of spice, and it can do so in small quantities. But yeah, that's the rye. But the others, it's the overall complexity. It probably factors in. It's not just as simple as with oats and wheat and the malted and unmalted barley, just add oats and you get this specific flavour profile. You have to work the whole ratio against itself.
So with all the different grains, malted, unmalted, different ratios, how many combinations did you try?
10. So there were 10 official ones, and then 2 controls that were given to the panelists. Which were just malt and raw barley, and just to give some sort of calibration. and then they went off and did some more rye projects as a kind of addendum. But the original spread was a spread of 10, and it was done again within that. It's a kind of weighing two things at once. One is keeping it decimalized in a way that allows charts to be drawn on my end that look reasonable, and then the other is using heritage mash bills, and so you're kind of wielding two spoons as a knife. But anyway, so they had spreads like one would have say 15% oats, and then it would have 30% oats, and one would have 15% oats, 15% wheat, one would have 15% oats, 15% rye, one would have 30% wheat, etc. So they had to be drawn from precedent, but also similarly, the ones that were picked to be distilled were picked because they fit into this kind of exploratory frame. And yeah, what should have seemed obvious to us at the time was that again there was always this heartthrob about we're going to up the wheat, but there's the subtractive process as well, and it's not just that you get diminishing returns, but it's what are you taking from to give that? Are you taking it from the malt? Are you taking it away from the oats? Are you taking it away from the raw barley? So everything exists in harmony with the other percentages. That you have to give to take away, and you have to take away to give. So again, that was quite a shock. We got the results back. So we had a panel of about 27 master blenders and distillers from anyone who would say yes to my email spams, and we borrowed the methodology from a lot of the testing that was done here, because there was no academic framework in Ireland for that kind of testing. All of that had happened in Scotland, and I consulted with a few people here to kind of make sure we were asking the right questions, and we asked, you're taking a highly subjective experience and trying to make it as objective as possible. So they'd get the spread of mashes cut to blending strength, and then they're asked a question that says, say, on a scale of 0 to 3, 0 being not present at all, 3 being extremely present, and you have to keep it in these, or the logic is to keep it in these parameters that are not risking, well, somebody's 7 is somebody else's 5 or whatever. Try and keep it as basic as possible. And some of the results were, again, Michael was on to me and he said, wouldn't it be hilarious? Because we were keeping a log the whole time where I would just chat to Michael about the flavours. And he said, wouldn't it be hilarious if the great findings that you and I are a bunch of bluffers and all our tasting notes
we had nailed our colours. We had nailed our colours to the mast as to what we thought. But of course, the real benefit as well is that thankfully we weren't found out. But the real thing, the benefit of it is, as though we did 12, I suppose if you want to count the controls recipes for the specific experiment, the real benefit is that the learnings become, it's not a preconception. It's not like, oh Jesus, this distillery back in 100 years ago made incredible and it's incredible whiskey, because there's more lies than truths told about what was happening, and you have your own preconceptions that will cloud your vision. But to have actually plottable, like this happens, this moves, and you're then not just venturing into something for some romantic idea of what could potentially be there. So from that we have, I suppose we closed some gaps in the experiment, particularly with the rye perspective. But from a distiller, my point of view, I've now been able to create, we pushed it to 35 recipes, where I tried to create specific flavours, and the potential that I see it is that you're not just, as much as whiskey is obviously an incredibly brilliant craft, and some of it is the exact science and some of it is left to chance. The more control you can take back about creating specific flavours, all of these recipes we hope will fit within a pot still whiskey technical file. So you're taking something that has a ratio of malted barley, unmalted barley, wheat and oats or whatever, and it creates this flavour profile, and then you're taking a different recipe and it creates that. And then when you're fast forward 5, 10, 20 years and you're trying to create a distillate, you're not just waiting to see what's presented to you by the cask, but able to go, well, actually, I wish this had a little bit more spice. Where's that rye distillate? And you can pull it in. Or where's that you want a little bit more creaminess and body, and you bring in the oat or the high wheats. And so that's where, because I'm a distiller but blender, but to put my blending hat on, what would I want in front of myself? And it's never been an issue that I have too many different flavors that I can pull together to create a product. The problem more occurs when you have one singular and you're leaving it down to the age statement, and well, if we leave it 2 more years, it might get to where we wanted to go, but it might not. But to be able to use these, to create a pantry of flavors, a spice rack, if you will, of something that you can pull from here and there to something that I'm very excited to be potentially able to use as a blender down the line. And that's kind of one of the disconnects that can sometimes be there within the distilling industry. You're distilling today for something that might not be a product for 10 plus years. So you're not always that worried about somebody else's job in 15 years time, although it might be your own, depending on how you agree. So there's sometimes that disconnect, but to be able to create these specific things to know that if that gap didn't exist of time, because nothing, okay, maturation does happen and the cask does its work, but you can't bump it one way or the other too much. It's going to go in its direction. So to be able to kind of put that hat on and be able to go, okay, what would I like to have sat in front of me, and to take it beyond simply malted barley, which obviously, as we would be well aware, we're all lovers of malted whiskey, creates wonderful flavour profiles, but to not just limit it to there, because as Fionnán's research into history can prove, there's plenty of examples of other grains. They're readily available. We can grow things like oats quite easily. So there's no reason not to, bar some challenges, but they're not insurmountable challenges. A mash filter, doing a step mash is not the most complex thing in the world, and a mash filter press, although it's maybe a bit more expensive, it's becoming more commonplace in newer distilleries. And if the results are what we hope they will be, and what we've seen from young whiskies or new make spirits, it certainly seems almost completely logical, as opposed to some mad idea. It just makes absolute sense to myself anyway. So
did I hear you correctly saying you have 35 recipes?
Yeah, and counting, yeah. So the crux of us, you would do is you would obviously focus on certain characteristics. This is something different people have different attributes they want from a whiskey. I particularly, my affinity is towards traditional pot still whiskey, which has some sweetness that you'd attribute and mellowness that might come with Irish, but it's amplified. It has more viscosity and more spice, and that's kind of the direction I like to go and pursue when I'm creating this style of distillate. And then you have maybe smaller quantities. It's not spread evenly between 35. It would be, you make a little bit of this and you make a little bit of that, and then as that develops and you become more aware on what products and what works for you and what is useful, you can make more of this and you make more of that. The problem is time, and that's it. By the time I know what they're like as 20-year-old whiskey, it'll be somebody else's job to start laying down new spirits, but such is the industry.
So are you working towards 35 different recipes, or have you got something else?
I think
potential.
We've just been when we do the mash bill, we've been doing it. The bulk of it's either the rye, the oats, or the wheat. But the most we do is about between 53 and 56%. The other part of it is only in the malt. I've got a few ideas. I think the concept of what you've done regarding the different components adding a different flavour profile. The one that I've got a list as long as my arm of what I'd like to do. For me, what I'm trying to understand is the distillate flavour that I get from these different grain bills. How does that then mature? Because it's doing all the work to get the difference in the distillate. Is that being realised when you mature it? So that's something that I'm just trying to learn. We're not as detailed as what these guys have been doing. I wish I could, but I only get 1 week a year where I can do some testing. But I think for me it's I have the capability and the equipment I've got to pull different levers. So it's about understanding these different levers and looking at the grain. Maybe I'll look at in the future doing a different mash bill of all four components, and then seeing how that matures out. So it's very much an early stage for me, is understanding what flavours we can get from different grains, and then how is that transferable during a maturation.
Excellent. Well, once your matured samples start coming off stream, I'd be glad to taste them for you. So thanks very much, gents. That was a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.